Greetings, greetings. It's difficult to have a workshop with so many people, but we will try. One of the things that we did, we weren't sure how many we would have, and we also had to deal with copying and transporting, so we only had 50 of these sheets that we passed around. But so you have to share and share alike. But I thought that this would be a good thing to think about when we are thinking about forgiveness, because it talks about people who really didn't have enough wood to have a fire because each one was selfish and took it away, and they died from the cold because they could not share. And I think that that is something very important for us all to remember, that in our own lives, as we are working with theosophy and working with each other in a variety of ways, if we do not share, we suffocate ourselves. We die ourselves an inward death. And there's another story that's similar to this, that is a man, when he died and he was going to get a tour of the next world, and he went by and saw a table lavished with much food, but the people were fighting and jostling each other and cursing because they were chained to the table and the forks were too long to get the food to their mouths. And he said, "Boy, I don't want to be there, and take me to the next place." And so the guide took him to the next place, and there everybody was happy. Everybody had plenty because they were feeding the person across the table from them with the long forks. They could reach the person across the table, and so they fed each other. And I think that that's exactly the situation we are in. We have to feed each other. And because I think sharing and working together is where it's at, I have asked Tim Boyd to be with me. Now, Tim Boyd, many of you may not have met him before because he hasn't done a lot of travel internationally, but he is my vice president, and I met him a long time ago in the 1970s when we were both young theosophists, if you can believe it. All of us at one time were young theosophists, and we sat around the campfire together, we sang songs together, and over the years we have worked together for many causes connected with the Theosophical Society. He is now president of the Theosophical Order of Service, and he is also vice president of the Theosophical Society in America. So I thought this was a good opportunity for you to get to meet Tim and know somebody else from America. So, Tim, you want to tell them who I am, other than they may not know?
I'm going to shout because of who she is. She has the benefit of the microphone. One thing that comes with the presidency.
Wait a minute. Yeah.
Probably many of you know Betty. We had said we'd do each other's introductions, so that was mine. Betty Bland, as you know, is now president of the section in the United States of America, as she has been for the last 8 years. And as she told you, we met many, many years ago, back in the dark ages of the 1970s. I can remember at that time both of us had fully black heads of hair and quite lively people. Betty has maintained her liveliness, and I find myself feeling diminished in her presence these days. But we wanted to present this, Betty asked me to work with her in presenting this particular workshop. So on forgiveness. So I'm going to turn it over to Betty, and we'll take it from there.
Okay. We have been talking. I thought that I would give a little introduction to help us think about brotherhood. And then we have some sheets of quotes. We only have 50, so again, you will share, but from the traditional writings that will give us some thoughts to take home with us, and that will also, I hope, generate some discussion. Even though this is a large group, we are a family, and we can add our opinion. It'll just be a little more awkward. Certainly, as far as brotherhood or sisterhood or familyhood is concerned, we cannot have that unless we have forgiveness. That is an absolute tool, because as we work together and our elbows hit each other, we have to be able to forgive each other. We're going to step on each other's toes. We're going to disagree. We're going to have very strong opinions in one way or another. And yet, we have to recognize that the primary purpose of our work is to work together as brothers and sisters. And if we forget that, we're forgetting everything. And the masters have told us that they can tell the mettle of a person or the quality of a person by seeing the people work together and even have disagreements together, because in that you can really tell what a person is like, and you can learn to trust each other when you've worked through difficulties. So to be in conflict or to be in a situation where we need to forgive each other is a part of our test of working in this life. So it's a crucial tool. Now, I think we've talked about the fact that we ought to be brotherly, but it's very difficult to know what we ought to do and how to do it. So I hope that we can have some discussion back and forth on how we might approach it. If you think about the fact that when you cannot forgive somebody and you think in your own mind that you're punishing that person, actually you are punishing yourself. And what you're doing is putting a ball and chain around your own foot and dragging it everywhere you go, and thinking somehow that you're making that other person suffer because you're suffering. It's not true. And in fact, they may not even know all the anger you have towards them, or they may know it. Either way, you're the one who's suffering. And I can give you an example. An uncle that I had, he owned a small business, and he brought somebody in to buy his business out so he could retire. Well, the person came in and stole his business rather than actually buying it. And my uncle was so distressed. Am I not talking loud enough? Okay. The uncle was so distressed by this that he couldn't forgive this person, and for the next 20 years, he sat in his chair like an old grump. And his grandchildren grew up around him but never knew him as anything but an old grump. He had enough to live, he just wasn't well off. He could have lived a happy 20 years, but instead he held on to that one hurt. And that's how important it is for us to do in our theosophical lives and in our personal lives. We cannot hold on to those hurts. And I thought that I would tell you just a brief little story of myself, because sometimes if you know what someone has experienced, then you can apply it to yourself. And this is a rather strange story, but it is true that occurred in my psyche. Some of you may know that I had a near-death experience, and that's what brought me to Theosophy. This is not about my near-death experience, but it's about something that occurred when I was in this state of being very highly psychically sensitive and very loosely connected to my physical body. I had a disagreement with my mother. I thought I knew more than my mother. At age 20, I definitely thought that she was not very smart and that I knew everything. And so my husband and I, it did take, my husband, who's my assistant running around in the yellow T-shirt, wanted to get married, and my mother thought that it was entirely too early, that I should not get married at 20. And so we went ahead and got married, but there was this little separation between my mother, who is a very dear person, really, and myself because of this. And I say this because I think it's important to know that indifference is as bad as hatred. Indifference to a person, shutting them off and saying they don't count, is another kind of hatred. And so I didn't have active hatred toward her, but I had a wall of indifference where I wouldn't let her into my heart, really. I mean, we interacted and we were civil, but my heart was closed. And when I was in a very compromised state, physical state, she came to the hospital to see me. And when I saw her, and I was in a very psychic state at that time because my body was not very connected to me, I could see her total concern and care and none of the little stuff between us. And in seeing that, and we should be able to see every person like that, really, to recognize they are a person and they are dealing within their own selves. So I saw her in that way, and I was able to just let go. I forgave. Everything fell away as far as this petty little thing between us. And in doing so, I experienced as if I had a glass shell around me that blocked me out from life, really. And I couldn't tell that there was a shell there because it was like clear glass. But the note of forgiveness, when it was sounded, shattered the glass. And in the shattering, it fell away, and I could tell that I had let go of this terrible block in my heart. And when that shattered, it's like I was in another realm. I was free, my spirit was free, and I heard, I would say, like the sound of angels, the music of angels, or the music of the spheres. It was a very uplifting, beautiful experience, which I could have never had if I would not have been able to let go of that in forgiveness. So that's what kind of ball and chain we all carry to some degree with somebody, and it is a ball and chain, and we have to be able to gradually peel those layers off and let go and be open and friendly to other people. I'm going to let Tim make some comments back about that, and then we will move along with discussion.
As Betty was talking, it occurred to me, I had heard the story. I don't really know if it's true or not. Maybe somebody here does. But that there is a way in which monkeys are sometimes trapped, where they will put some sort of food inside of a container just big enough for the monkey to get his hand in. And then the monkey will put his hand in to grab the food. And at the point that he does that, they will come to take him away. And it would be the easiest thing in the world for the monkey to let go and run. But apparently, the monkeys are easily trapped because they just won't let go. They continue to hold on. I find it a good story. Actually, I've never seen a monkey trapped in this way. But it often seems that many of stories that are spoken of about monkeys sometimes have a very broad application to us as people as well. It's sort of a strange thing. The monkey mind trapping the monkey. But in this terms of speaking of forgiveness, one of the expressions that I have heard that seems to apply, and I think in some of the things that Dr. Krishna said earlier, this idea was also addressed, that our inability or our unwillingness to forgive is a poison that we take, hoping to do harm to someone else. When really, the holding on to these memory patterns, the inability to release, only does harm to ourselves and creates these sorts of divisions and separations that diminish us. So I think in terms of what Betty's sharing this afternoon, one of the beauties of the teachings of theosophy is that there are many exalted teachings that speak in terms of our ability to unfold the deeper aspects of our own being, to release some of these memories, desires, all of the things that tend to bind us in the state of contention and that we experience so often. One of the problems I think that we experience is that very often the wisdom that has been handed to us is in fact profound. And yet, in a certain way, it's very easy for us to repeat the words that it has been given us to. The clothing that it's been wrapped in is something that's very easy for us to speak about, to think about. But then the real difficulty comes in how do we move from the state of perhaps confusion or the state of feeling somehow not fulfilled or the state of searching for or grasping for more that most of us tend to operate in. How do we move from that point to this more exalted level that seems to be universally spoken of. The masters talk about the need for unselfishness. Over and over and over again, we hear unselfishness. And it's an easy word. It rolls off my tongue quite easily. And yet the difficulty always comes in when do we know that we are actually moving in that direction? How do we do that? And so I think that's part of what the idea of today's workshop is designed to address. That middle ground between where we find ourselves and where we somehow imagine we would like to be.
Oh, right. Yeah. What might be good for us to do as we have opened it up, I think we might have generated ideas in people now that may have something you would like to comment or share on and before we move to another part of this workshop. Does anybody, I have Dave, oh, yeah. Yes, Fabian. Right here.
Oui, Fabien. Petit Tim, I try to explain it in English slowly. Is it a connection between forgiveness and justice? I explain. If my choice is revenge, I can forgive anybody. If my choice is justice, it's okay, I can forgive. So is it a connection? What do you think about?
What do you think about that, Betty?
Well, I'll say something and you can add to it. I think that we have to be very careful to separate the sense of safety and protection from forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean being a doormat. Never be a doormat. But be sure that one is safe and that whatever family one has, one can protect. And make sure that you protect so that it doesn't happen again, such as a battered wife has to get away from the situation. She can't say, oh, I forgive him, and then let him do it again. That's totally not what we're talking about. So one has to always be safe in order to be able to forgive. Now, there are terrible things that happen that one would feel like could never be forgiven. Things like the Holocaust, murdering one's children, various things that you just feel you could never forgive. And yet, we have to. If we are safe and if our family is safe, we first have to work towards safety. But once one has safety, one has to be able to let go, or one keeps that shell or burden around one's ankle. But that's a very good question because people often can confuse forgiveness and the need to be safe to protect oneself. Yeah.
In Australia, we had a very bad...
Speak right into it.
So is that better?
Yeah.
In Australia, we had a very bad case of a young woman who was raped by 4 men and then killed. And her name was Anita Cobby. And her father, who was a very good Christian, because it is in fact a Christian message, has spent the last 15 years or more going around preaching forgiveness. He went into the jail, he forgave all those men. Because exactly what you said, if he hung on to that pain, and it was a terrible, terrible thing, but what could he do? Could he live the rest of his life in absolute pain? Or he has managed to make out of a terrible tragedy, he has taught so many people the the purpose of forgiveness. There's no justice, just forgiveness.
I have a good friend who is an
There's one
attorney
right here, too.
who has said that in all of his years of legal practice, he has never had one person come into his office and ask for justice. Everyone that has come to him has always asked to win the case. And that to them is justice. So I think very often when we think in terms of what is just, it often is a very difficult process to separate our desires and our perception from this broader idea of justice. In the Golden Stairs is the idea of a courageous endurance of that which we would deem to be personal injustice. And so those two things I think are very, to forgive even in the absence of a sense of justice is perhaps a higher demand for us. But somebody else wanted to say something.
Okay. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. My name is Kiran Shah. This is a true story. As you mentioned it earlier, that we carry, if we don't forgive, we carry that tension with us all the time. This is a true story. It's a very extreme story. I'm from a Jain religion. It is more or less like Buddhism. It is a contemporary. Now, we have got priests, we call them munis, and they preach. We actually, every year, we have got religious 8 days festival day, and the last day we say, Ichami Dukkanam. That means we forgive everybody, whether what have we done by thought, speech, and action. We say, we forgive you, please forgive us. Now, this story is this like this. There was a lady, her husband was murdered. And she had a lot of, that feeling about that person who murdered them. There were a couple of them. Now, this person who was preaching, he saw that lady coming every day to listen to her, to listen to him. So he thought of, how could I tell this lady to forgive that murderer? That man was in the jail. He said, you got another custom, every year once, sister puts a thread round the brother's hand for protection of the whole year. He says, I'm giving you the thread that, put this thread that you are protected. Now this Muni preacher wanted that lady to go to the jail and put that thread round that man. That lady said, how could I do it? This is a man who murdered my man. How could I do it? He couldn't convince, but somehow he was able to manage. And eventually she agreed. She went there, and that it was told to those people that this lady whom husband you murdered will come and put thread around you. They were shocked also. Now, there is a custom also, they must give, the brother must give something to her sister. So they collected some money, he says, we will give you. She went to the jail, he says, now we will look after you throughout your life for your maintenance. He says, I don't want anything. I came here to forgive. What has happened has happened. I don't want to carry everything all my life. She put the thread, that eyes, they start crying. Even that lady crying, that murderers were crying. They said, how could this happen? This lady who came and forgive us whom we murdered. They gave you some money. She says, I don't want anything. But anyway, she took and she gave in charity. So as you have mentioned, we get completely relieved if we carry on anything which has happened to us, difference of opinion, somebody has hurt us, injustice has done to us. But if we just forgive it, we are completely relieved and we let things go. Thank you.
So that's another example of how forgiveness, even in a terrible situation, brought great relief and healing. It is a very necessary and spiritual path to be able to forgive. Is there, okay.
the story that you told about...
Put the mic close to your mouth.
Yeah, in the true story that you told about what happened between you and your mother, the forgiveness came spontaneously. Life brought it in a certain situation. Could you have done that through a decision? Because when we say to people, you must forgive, you're asking them to decide to forgive.
That's a very good question. Let me respond to that, and then we'll let the next man ask. I was very fortunate to have that experience, to see it in its totality and let it go. I'm not sure. It would have taken me much longer and much more suffering. But since then, I have done a lot of thinking about forgiving. And we don't see everything that's in our psyche. We think we've let go, and there's still threads hanging on. So it takes a lot of self-awareness and meditative reflection to be able to finally let go of something. As we work with it, however, it begins dissolving. We have to have that intention first. And one example that I can give, some people may remember Dora Kuntz, but she was a president of the Theosophical Society some years ago, almost after I first joined. Joy Mills was president when I joined. But Dora Kuntz was strongly psychic, and she had studied under Leadbeater, and she was one of the children at the manor and so forth that had studied under him. And she said, and this is again recognizing that you have to feel safe in order to forgive. She recommended that if you have somebody that you need to forgive, you can't say, I love them, because your heart won't believe it. But you can say, I wish you goodwill. I send goodwill that you will be happy, find your happiness. And she suggested that you view the person through a tunnel, that as if they are very far removed from you, so that you somehow feel safe and don't feel like they're right in your face. And sensing that they are at a distance from you, that then you can send them goodwill. And in doing that, you can begin breaking down this resentment that builds. So that was a very good question. Thank you. Yes.
He has changed his mind.
You know, it is very easy to talk about forgiveness, but it's very hard to forgive. I am talking about a woman living in a slum, total poverty in Nairobi. She gets beaten every day by her husband, and she forgives him. So I wonder sometimes, she cooks for him, she does everything for him. I wonder sometimes that really, when will she feel safe to forgive him? Will she not retaliate? And if she retaliates, would you say she is wrong? If she doesn't forgive him and hits him or does something drastic, something like that happened in England. The woman killed her husband because she couldn't take it anymore. Now she was safe, and if she forgave her husband who has already died, would you call it forgiveness? You know, forgiveness is so hard. And you only can forgive if you feel that by doing that you are safe. If you are in the situation, it's very hard. So forgiveness is very hard to do it. Very, very hard. Very easy to say forgive and forget. But there's one more point that I should like to make. It is easier to forgive once time takes on. As time goes on, something that happened 2 years back, 4 years back, it's easier to put it at the back of your mind. But you never forgive. The last point that I want to make is, suppose if I've done something wrong to you, and I come and say to you, oh, I'm sorry, please forgive me for having hurt your feelings. Now that, from a soul to soul, you might say, see, she came and said sorry to me. So you might become a bit arrogant. So isn't that a bad side of forgiving? I come to you and say sorry, and you say, see? Thank you.
That's a very interesting comment. If the person becomes arrogant because we forgave them, they've got to live in their arrogance. But our forgiveness releases us from any involvement with them. So I would say just let them be arrogant. They've got to live with it. And in their own skin, that arrogance doesn't feel very comfortable. Ultimately, and I think this is true in all situations, ultimately, our inner nature, our higher self, knows. And we try to stuff it down. We might want to pretend it's not there, but it knows, and it's going to gnaw at you one way or the other. And that woman's arrogance at some point in time will turn against her in a way that will teach her. As far as forgiving somebody when something recurs and recurs, as I said before, forgiveness does not mean being a doormat at all. And one should seek one's safety first. Now that the husband is dead, it's good to forgive him. But I would have gotten away. Now, retaliation doesn't do anything. Yeah, say, now you're dead, I can forgive you. But retaliation would have only brought her more suffering. The thing to do, and this is one of the really bad situations, women are so abused all over the world, and we have to provide more shelters, more ways that people can find safety. David and I ourselves have taken in 2 people, I believe, who had bad marriages and were trying to get away from it. One just left her house with nothing but a suitcase and fled to our house, and her husband didn't know where she was for a month or so because she had to get away and find her own safety. So that's a very serious problem. Well, no, they will want to know.
Well, it's not really a question,
That's
but
all right.
you used a couple of times the word doorman, but I don't know what it is. Ah,
Yeah, a doormat, that's a good question, because other people might not know. I have all kinds of colorful language.
Betty is from a region of the United States that is known for colorful language, the southern part of the U.S. So us northerners, I just glory in her use of speech.
We use a lot of metaphors, but the doormat is the mat that is at the entrance before you come into the house that you wipe your feet on, and it gets treated the worst of anything in the whole house. If you're a doormat, get up and get out of there. Oh, doorman, no. My language, excuse it.
One more back here, Betty.
Yeah.
I have two things to say. One is a little story which I really like. It's about forgiveness and how it is we need to choose. This is a story between two friends, which I read somewhere. They are going on a path together, and something happens, and one friend shouts at the other friend. So this friend gets down as they are crossing the river, and he writes on the sand and says, "My friend shouted at me," and the wave comes and takes it away. After some time, they're going again together. They continue their journey together, and the friend who shouted turns and gives this one a hug. And he gets down and writes on the rock and says, "My friend, give me a hug." So it's really our choice on, what we choose to hold in ourselves that goes a long way into bringing about forgiveness. But when I read this first, I had to actually experiment with it. And I started to look into why it is so difficult to forgive. And one of the things that I do notice about when something wrong happens or what I perceive as wrong, it's difficult to forgive somebody because we have an image. I have an image of myself as being good, as being kind, as being compassionate or brotherly or whatever. The image is always better than who we are. Maybe it is who we would like to be. And sometimes when we are with a person in whose company we kind of do that which shows our real self, it's difficult to forgive first my own self for having fallen short of my estimate of who I am. And it's only when that acceptance of oneself as being lesser than one's image, when I can meet that, then it becomes so much more easier to forgive the other, because the other has just been a mirror to bring me to terms with my own self. I just thought I would share.
That's a very good comment also, because one of the things that's very hard for us to do is to forgive ourselves. And that's one of the first steps in forgiveness, is forgiving ourselves. After all, we are not perfect, and somehow in our growing up, it is a part of the human psyche to have the great need to be somehow perfect or admirable. And so when we have gotten messages that we are not perfect, it is very difficult to deal with. And yet each of us has to finally come to terms that this inner light within us is perfect. We might not express it well, but it is perfect, and we are who we should be right this moment. We're a seed ready to grow, and we just have to begin growing. Our ego is the most fragile thing that we have. It's like it's made out of gossamer glass. And we tend to hold it right here in front of ourselves and say, "Don't you dare touch this. Don't knock this off." And we have to begin being okay to be vulnerable. to be who we are, and it's okay to have made a mistake and pick up and go on from here. One of the ways that you might think is, rather than being a glass door, which when the wind catches it, slams shut and breaks, if we can be more like a screen door, when the wind catches it, it goes through it. It doesn't have this big ego to hit, and so it can go through it. And then we can be able to forgive more. So sometimes when somebody has hit your ego, think in terms of maybe I can be a screen door and just let that pass through unnoticed, and it doesn't have to attack me and my innermost self.
Betty, we have one over here on your left.
Thank you. There was mentioned that to forgive is a terrible problem. But why? I have an impression that it is a mid of a process to forgive. Before forgiving, we have to understand the background of the special behaviors or special cases or people. What are the intentions of this and that man, including ourselves also. So before to forgive, we need an understanding, but we can only understand things what we have experienced. We need experiences before understanding also. So it is a long process to come to forgiveness, and only after forgiveness comes the next step in this program is the cooperation to work together with each other. It is the next step.
Okay, so...
See I well this process,
Right. So you're saying that understanding brings forgiveness, if you truly understand. And yet sometimes we don't understand and have to forgive anyway, so that's a part of it. Even, however, as we look at ourselves more and more deeply and see our own flaws, perhaps we will have more understanding for other people's flaws, or, problems of, if you can't understand the word flaw, that I pronounce it oddly, but their difficulties or whatever. So still I say that if we look into ourselves and see that inner problem, I mean, we all have inner weaknesses, and sometimes I see all kinds of situations and I think, there, but for the grace of God go I. Because we are so formed by our experiences in our life, and we could have been the beggar on the street or the murderer who was having a drug habit and killing to keep the drug habit going. We might have been there. We might have been there our last life. If we don't watch it, we might be there our next life. So just as we turn understanding towards ourselves, we might be able to see more understanding in others, too.
Another? Betty? Here.
Yeah, there's several around here.
Yes, I have an observation. Like the other lady said, there's a woman who's being abused. She's beaten by her husband all the time. And once she's beaten, she forgives him. Now, at what stage does she forgive? When requested to forgive? Or each time she's beaten, naturally she forgives? Now, when we forgive, I see some problems sometimes. Is the person forgiving? What is his attitude? What is his feelings towards the person who's being forgiven? Sometimes I see so much of that attachment to the person who's forgiving. He feels superior, he feels great that he forgave. Now, can we forgive if someone doesn't even ask for forgiveness? When do we have to go forgive? Or the person who's forgiven, what is his or her attitude towards the forgiver? Is it a feeling of inferiority, or there's equalness in our attitude or in our attitude? So when we forgive, when we're asked, can we forgive? Or without asking, being asked to forgive, can we still forgive?
There was an American president who probably is not the best example of the spiritual goal of forgiveness, but he made an interesting comment about forgiveness. And what he said is that you should always forgive, but you should never forget their names. So in the example, sometimes we talk about forgiveness, and I don't think that we're using the word properly every time. Perhaps to be beaten and to forgive is maybe more along the line of compliance sometime. And then often when we ask someone for forgiveness, sometimes it's along the line of perhaps manipulation. There are all sorts of different characteristics that sometimes bleed into this word. But I think the identifying feature for it, at least within ourselves, because really forgiveness has nothing so much to do with the person or the act, so much as it has to do with a particular state, a process, as was spoken before, that freedom of an interior sort is really the experience of any sort of true forgiveness. There is the sense of not being attached to the action, which we had called bad, to the person, which we had called a perpetrator. That somehow or another, the shift that takes place is not a matter of what words or what language we use. The word we're using is forgiveness. It's the best we can do, apparently. But there is, in fact, a state of consciousness, a state of awareness that we do experience. And to the extent that we're able to identify and recognize that experience, it becomes something that we can not repeat like a parrot repeats something, but we become able to, as we do with other states of consciousness, to be aware of how they influence our thinking, to be aware sometimes of the process that it took to arrive at that, and to be able to consciously bring these things into play in all of these different instances. Obviously, it's not easy, and that's why that president said what he said. But we always have these choices, and I think that's always that's one of the beauties of our condition. We can choose, and how we choose, our choices in the past have determined how we respond now. The fact that we hold on to grievances, the fact that we have an inability very often to forgive. We have other choices that we have made. We can recognize what that has done to our state of awareness and choose to behave in that way. There's a certain freedom in that. It may not be the first and the last freedom, but certainly it would be the most recent one. Somebody had something to say over here.
I think it was answered yet, but in any case, who forgives?
Short and sweet.
Who forgives? Tim, you want to say?
Well, I mean, often it seems that when we're talking about forgiveness, we have this habit of pointing to ourselves. I always like the way the Tibetan people I know, often when they're talking about me, I'll point to something like this. For some reason, I find the Dalai Lama, he points to his nose. I don't know what that means necessarily. But who is it that forgives? It's this kind of aggregate of consciousness that we have come to call I. that somehow projects this thought of forgiveness, and then determining, the fact that determines what forgiveness is for us is really how clear we are in terms of recognizing what this consciousness is that's operating. If we don't recognize it, we can use the words forever. I mean, I've seen people forgive and then go straight back to fighting. Was it forgiveness? Who was it that forgave? Some aspect of an ego. It satisfied some need to speak those words. But I think, again, we all have these experiences. Otherwise, these words would be meaningless. We have an experience of what it means to be internally free. And to the extent that we experience that again, we're in a state of forgiveness. We're in a state of peace. All of these words actually describe the same state. When we're still, we're forgiving. When we're peaceful, we're forgiving. When we're joyous, you can't be joyous and be unforgiving. So all of these things, we've kind of broken it down into little segments. And then we tend to think that these segments have some reality of their own, which is the mistake that we tend to enjoy. But always, all of these things we can always relate back to our own experience. And we all have it. Which is why, one of the beauties of theosophy, Theosophical Society, is that it doesn't require somebody to tell us. What it does tell us is that you have the capacity to make the choices, to remind yourself of the experience that's internal already. And that's a beautiful thing. Julia, you wanted to say something?
My English is very poor, but I have to say, who is the person or the self that forgive? I understand that who forgives is who comprehends the inner self, who comprehends the inner self, not forgive, but learn. Then it's very useful to learn and forgive the process. As a child, when is learning to write. First, he has to learn how to write the A, and so and so. When the child is capable of write, this child forgive, this child has no necessity of being always remembering how to learn each one of the letters. But the real self can write poems and so very easily and forgive how to learn each one of the letters. I thought that the person is not who forgive or who learn. The learning is from the soul, from the inner self, and the process is given by the personality that is who always is trying to suffer for everything. The personality tries always to be suffering or enjoying, but the self is always ready to learn. This is the difference. Thank you.
So we can say that various experiences that come to us that we have to deal with forgiveness are sometimes like the lines that we have to learn to write between, and that are very useful to us, although we don't like them. No pain, no gain. We'll take one more comment and then, okay, wherever you got it. Okay.
I appreciate there was one very, very short question. Who forgives? And in my experience, the one who forgives first has to put a blame, has to see a sin, because only a sin can be forgiven. If the one doesn't see a sin, there is no necessity for forgiveness. But then there is interconnectedness. That was the second part of this working party.
I always look to someone with a gray beard for wisdom.
Yes, yes. Actually, the person may not have sinned at all, and yet if we have resentment against them, we have to learn to forgive them. Such as my mother, she really was very smart, and I probably shouldn't have gone against her in the way that I did. But so she didn't really sin, but I still had to forgive her because I built the resentment toward her. So it's something to think about, that when we feel that someone has wronged us, they may not even have the sense that they have wronged us. So it is mostly our internal resentments that call forward the need for forgiveness. We're getting close to the end of our time, and we had a little exercise we wanted to do before we end, but I thought, let me bring up just a couple other things that I thought of. One is, and I think this is something that we can carry with us too, is look at our own attitudes, and are we critical of others, or do we rejoice in others' activities? Think about it, because it's very easy to be critical, and as soon as we're critical of others, there's something in ourselves that is not forgiving itself, and so we're projecting out trying to say, well, we would be better than they are some way. So just look at yourself and watch every time you catch yourself being critical and think, maybe I better turn in the other direction. And another little thought about forgiveness is when you look at some of the things that you have to let go of in your life, think about the 100-year rule. How much difference is this going to make in 100 years? And then you can see from a different perspective. And one other thing that I had was to visualize in yourself a compassionate attitude. Try to hold a sense of a compassionate attitude within yourself as opposed to the criticality, and see how that feels over time. I think you'll find you just feel lighter and happier. Okay, go ahead. Do you want to say any? I thought you had some. Oh, one tiny comment, very short.
Tiny comment?
He's right here, I thought. Oh. Oh, and 1 second one, since she's been standing up. Okay. 2 tiny comments.
I think once we know who we are and we know the principle of karma, then we know anything that happens to us, whenever it happens to us, it doesn't happen without reason. There is a reason behind that. And without reason, it doesn't happen, So, we have to forgive. The best thing is to forgive because we do not know. We do not know our past. We do not know how many lives we have lived. So whatever we have done and why we have to suffer that. So the best thing is to forgive, to settle our account with the person. It's no use continuing with that, And then again, it's right thing to, even if he has done wrong to you, you should do that, so that, he would not suffer. You do not want him to suffer, Otherwise, you just leave it there. You are going to suffer yourself, and he is also going to suffer. So to forgive him also. And you will be forgiven also. Okay. So both ways it works, So best thing is to forgive. In whatever sense, whether it's in your doormat or whatever it is. The best thing is to forgive.
Okay.
That is the biggest principle that we have in life. That's it. Because
All
then
right.
you know that you are a soul. You are not what you think you are. And once you know what you are, then best thing is to forgive.
That's true. Thank you. We'll give it the one more.
One more.
Very short.
Yeah, if we understand the theory of karma, whatever happens to us during the life, it's our own karma. If we understand that theory, then we can forgive anyone, any time, whatever happens, we can forgive very, very easily.
Okay. All right. One of the ways to help us develop forgiveness is to practice metta, M-E-T-T-A, which is loving kindness meditation. And I have asked him to close our session with a short metta devotion meditation.
Probably all of you are familiar with the practice of loving kindness, metta practice, so just get comfortable in your seats. And this has been a long day, so it might be well just to take a couple of deep breaths in and out, perhaps to regenerate ourselves just a bit. And now, begin with the loving practice, loving kindness practice, directing it to ourselves. And in our thoughts and in our hearts, repeating the words and generating the feeling, may I be happy. May I be safe and free from harm. May I be at peace. And in our quiet meditation, to allow this sense of love and loving kindness to spread abroad, calling to mind the faces of friends, of family, of fellow theosophists. Let us generate this same feeling and this same wish within our hearts. May all of these friends, may all of this family, may they all be happy and free from pain. May they have safety and harmony. May all of these beings be at peace. And now let us bring to mind those individuals that we may have a feeling of unkindness toward, who have perhaps done us harm, have harmed our friends, our family, those that we identify as our people. And the same sense of loving kindness that we feel for ourselves, that we feel for our friends, Let us embrace them in the same loving kindness, thinking within our hearts, may all of these people who have done harm to me and mine be happy and free from pain. May they all be safe and dwell in harmony. May they all have peace. May all beings, vast as space, wherever they find themselves, have happiness, safety, and peace. Oh.
Thank you, Tim. This concludes our workshop except for one thing. We have a set of quotes that we pulled out that relate to forgiveness. We only have 50 copies, but if you would like to share them and have those to study and take and reflect on, we offer those to you for your reflection. Thank you very much for participating.